Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Malazian Empire, or in this case, the state of the siege of Kapustan. And we start with the knitting part. I can show you that this has grown alarmingly since yesterday. Yeah, it's already like, I don't know, longer than my elbow. And when I throw this cape style over my back, it actually already goes down to like here. That's pretty cool, I think. I mean, we're still far from where it will be in the end, but holy shit, this went fast. I suspect we might actually get done after House of Chains. Maybe even before that. We will see. Anyway, so now that that's out of the way, let's focus on book 3 of Memories of Ice, Kapustan. Cheers. All right, so yeah, book 4 begins with a lot of stuff about the siege of Kapustan, or the end of the siege of Kapustan slash the fall. It's not really that much of a siege. It falls relatively quickly, at least the largest part of it. And oh boy, is there a lot to talk about. And I'll just, try to mention some of the things today, and we'll see how far we come. The rest will probably come tomorrow. And then I'll either do 2 videos that are not directly read through on Saturday and Sunday, or just one on Sunday. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, let's talk about a bunch of things that I kind of found interesting and feel where there's room to talk about more in the future. All right. So the big things to figure out is and I'll try to talk more about that later on in more abstract video, I suspect, is Gruntle. Obviously, Gruntle becoming whatever he is becoming. And also the end of Prince Jalakan. Is that his name? Oh god, I'm terrible at this, aren't I? Yeah, the end of him. There's something I've found interesting there. There's some more interesting imagery, mostly from what, at least the opening chapters of am I now 3 chapters in? Yeah, 3 chapters in. And the at least the opening chapters are very, very graphic and very visual. You know that you have parts of a story of the books that are rather not very visual. Where the imagery is not that important, or not that impressive, at least. And then you have chapters that are just very visual. For example, the opening of Gardens of the Moon with the Siege of Pale and Adamander Rake standing on Moonspawn and shooting down magic and stuff like that. That's a very, very cinematic visual scene, a cinematic visual chapter. And for example, long combat descriptions are obviously very visual and sometimes cinematic, sometimes extremely graphic and violent. And I should probably say we might talk later on about sexual violence, so consider this to be your trigger warning. I mean, I assume that people who've made it all the way to Memories of Ice are aware of the fact that in this series there is a lot of potentially triggering stuff happening. This is a series that pulls no punches, but in this video especially, and probably in another one later on, we are definitely going to talk about sexual violence for a moment. And that's yeah, consider this your trigger warning for this video. All right, so what do we need to talk about? We have a lot of, as I said, because it's a lot of battle scenes, a lot of combat here in this in the opening. The whole fall of Kapustan is very, very much a cinematic battle stuff that we need to talk about. We also need to talk. That was in book three, but I feel at some point we need to talk more about Talk the Younger. I'll probably do that tomorrow though, because I want to keep this halfway ordered, probably. Um, Sorry, I'm still rather rambly today. But let's go into the Siege of Kapistan. Like from the beginning of the setup of this book, we know um, that Kapistan will fall. We know that the relief armies are like Relief Army Dujak and the not the Bargath, but Dujak and the others, and the Kaladin Brood and the Tist Andy and the Rivi. They are 6 weeks away, which is a lot of time. Even if they hurry and so forth, they can't use magic because warrens have been poisoned by the crippled god. So yeah, we know that there's no relief coming. We have this faint hope that the whole Barghast army might come sooner, but even those are rather late. The interesting trick there that Erickson pulls is that we never know how long it actually takes to get to from the Barghast mountain to Kapustan. We don't know that. But there's always the idea that maybe it'll be possible for the Barghast to show up in time. They don't, which, is interesting to see. So basically, we have the situation that people are trapped in the city. The way that it is set up is that with the Tenuskauri and everything, it's clear that once the city falls, everyone dies. So it's a full-on trap. It's not that civilians will survive the whole thing. Everyone within the city at the point of full investiture is basically going to die, either in combat or later on. That's just basically the setup. There is something of a kind of not fully, Deus Ex Machina there, and I'm okay. I don't want to call it that. The point is, I am not quite sure if I maybe overlooked something while reading it this time around again. But the fact that the Grey Swords built all those tunnels to hide all the civilians, or all the civilians that want to hide, I'm not sure if that was ever properly set up, or it's just suddenly when they give the orders, like, okay, put them into the tunnels, we prepared. I mean, it's kind of set up in a way that that even the other priests, I think it's a Destrian, says like the mass council has still not officially agreed to the proposal of building those tunnels. So it kind of is made clear that this is sort of a surprise, but yeah. Sometimes it's okay to pull those surprises, and I feel even if it was actually not mentioned before, and I just not me just overlooking something. In this case, it's well done because it's also not the biggest how to say it doesn't spoil the entire thing. Also, we still get enough cannibalism and atrocities, so we can't complain. And the horror, the abhorrence of what the Tenuskauri do, or what they're forced to do, would not actually be more horrible if they actually would kill and eat the entire population of Kapistan. That's kind of the point there. We get enough exposure to cruelty and brutality and stuff like that. That it doesn't matter if it would be like, I don't know, 10 more or less, or 10,000 more or less. It doesn't, at this point, scale isn't important anymore. And that's, I guess, the next thing in general is atrocities become rather abstract if you scale the numbers up. That's basically the thing. It's like you talk about one person dying. This is like these sayings, like one person dying is a tragedy. A thousand people dying is just numbers. It's just statistics, and there's a certain truth to that. And Erickson handles it rather well for like the amount of brutality and atrocities committed in Kapistan. He handles it rather well by always zooming in on individual fates there. So that is done rather well. Okay, now let's talk about the first interesting thing there. The way Steven Erikson handles the rape of Stani Menakis. There's two things that I find interesting here and find important that I think are important here, and I'll probably elaborate on them later in a different video at some point. But the two things that I find important here are: one, we are not shown the actual events; we only get the aftermath. We also, the way the aftermath is shown is extremely interesting, because we get shown everything, and a bit later we see how actually Gruntle also doesn't realize what happened until she says something. That's kind of the interesting point. Like the description that he gives when Stonny comes out of the tower and is like, yeah, something has carved a part of her of the armor she wore, and one of her breasts is bared with bruises where someone grabbed it. And up to that point you can still think kind of, yeah, it's combat, people grapple, that just happens. And I guess that's sort of what Gruntle's up to that point, because it's Gruntle's viewpoint that we have at that point, basically. He doesn't realize it as well until she actually speaks out. And that's like a very important thing there, right there. It's like that a lot of times we don't realize these things when they happen in real life. We need to be told, and actually telling is extremely painful for the survivors of those situations. So that was done rather well, I felt, because it's a terrible thing. It needs to be addressed. It happens in war, it happens in everyday life, and the way it in this case is handled I found rather good, because we don't get, any, whether they are gratuitous or just like graphic descriptions of sexual violence. We just see the aftermath. Also, we see the whole way, the way it's just shown how she's still like high on adrenaline and probably under shock in that situation, and then the trauma setting in when she actually realized what happened to her. That all of that is just done very, very well, in a way, I felt. Also, the helplessness and guilt that Gruntle describe, like this, that Gruntle feels, all of that is just done very, very, very sensitive. I don't know words. This is what I'm trying to say. Like, it's just, all of that is handled extremely sensitive, is I guess the right word there. It's just the way all of that is handled. Him taking her home and then doing, and she also does not want to see, and that's the next big thing there. The idea that it's vitally important to not just see pity in other people, and she just like, you go out and kill people. That's the best you can do right now. I don't want to see you pity me. That's just, all of that is done rather well, because the way things like sexual violence are often, not always, handled in fantasy literature is not always that well done, is what I'm trying to say. The next important thing I felt is important here is that the victim we see here, the survivor we see here, I should say survivor, Stony Menakis, is a very strong character. She has been a very strong character before. She's the one who, kicks Gruntle's ass. She makes decisions. She decides to join the Grey Swords, or at least, not join the Grey Swords, but, actually join the defense, while Gruntle is still this aimless, depressed drunk and still dealing with his own demons because of the death of Harlow and all of that. She is proactive. She goes out and does things. That's obviously her way of coping, but like the way she was portrayed all the way to Kapustan from the Ruzistan, we always saw her as a very, like, at least outwardly acting very strong character. And that's important to show that the people who suffer, who are victims of sexual harassment or sexual violence, they can be anyone. They can explicitly also be, it's not about whatever ideas they're floating around. It's like, she's a very strong person, and it can happen to anyone. And that's the important thing there. I feel that it happens that we get shown how it not shown how it happens, but that it happens to someone like Stoni Menakis and not just some random, I don't know, damsel in distress type of woman character. Obviously, it could also be a male damsel in distress. I don't. Anyway, then we get shown that it's a proactive, strong character, and there's certainly, parallels in a way, not parallels, but Robin Hobb does something similar. Spoiler if you ever read the Life Ship Traders. There is something going on there that is very similar, where you also have a very strong character suffering from or surviving sexual assault at some point. All right, so those were just like things that I thought were handling within this extremely brutal scenes. Like those chapters are like super gory, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. Um, the way that basically that Erickson manages to zoom out or like fade out all the brutality and all the brutality and big cinematic battle violence, and just fades that out to just concentrate on that personal drama in that situation, was just handled extremely well, I felt. All right, so let's leave that part behind for now. I will have more to say on the matter at some point. All right, next thing we need to talk about. I suspect we should. Okay, so one thing that is like important is the whole idea of loyalty. Loyalty within the Grey Swords is something that's very interesting. Like, first thing I found fascinating, this is sort of a foreshadowing kind of thing, but keep in mind that even in book 3, Hetan always calls Itkovian wolf. Now, just keep that in mind for later on. I'll return to it. I'll just find it interesting. This time around, it's stuck in my mind that she calls him wolf and not boar, because he's the shield anvil of Fener, and he's a boar god, right? But she calls him wolf, and there's something in there, is what I'm trying to say. Just, those small foreshadowing kind of hints and stuff like that. Then loyalty, also irreverence, and how those small things kind of switch things. The way that Gruntle, when also religious interpretation plays into that, the idea that Gruntle going berserk and killing and killing and killing and killing, to probably assuage his guilt after the death of not death after the rape of Stani, and the obviously religious believing Grey Swords see in his cutlasses the tusks of Fenner. Now, that is a reasonable assumption. Anyone who's ever seen what a boar can do with its tusks, holy fucking shit! That, yeah. The comparison to cutlasses is not, the weirdest thing ever. But then he calls him like that, and then Gruntle says, like, let's call him Tiger Claws instead. And the interesting thing there is, obviously, we'll see something with the tiger stuff going on. But the idea is that if you are religious and are in a religious framework, you interpret things in your religious framework. So while let's say like a believer, a devout believer of the follower of Treach or Trake, the Tiger of Summer, would probably see tiger claws in that. A believer of Fenner obviously would see tusks in those cutlasses. Presumably someone who follows the wolf gods would see canines in that. I don't know, or talons. I have no idea. But the idea is basically you do whatever. And Gruntle at this point is super irreverent. He gets pissed off by the pious things that Itkovian says, and being the irreverent bastard that he is, he just tosses off that tiger claws thing to irritate Itkovian. But obviously, for someone who is more connected to the actual spiritual, I don't want to say spiritual world, but to the God's world, to the divine sphere in a way, that is a slap in the face. And it also shows us that, yes, words have meaning, words have power, even like tossed out, like, kind of things may have effects. Now, I'm not going to go into the question of whether it's Gruntle saying that, let's call him Tiger Claws, things that makes him, that gives Treach or Drake an opening to get in there and actually take him over. Because I don't know if that's the case or not. I'm just saying, from the outside, or for someone who believes in these divine powers and stuff like that, this is sort of the moment where it shifts. Or it looks like this may be the moment where it shifts. All right. Now let's look at loyalty. There's obviously the betrayal of the Grey Swords by Wrath Fener. And I'll have more to say on Wrath Fener, that whole thing later on, I suspect, but I need to read at least another chapter before I'm at the point where I have all of that stuff back in my mind. But of course, Wrath Fener betrays the Grey Swords. They know that they are betrayed, but they're going there anyway. And that's a very important thing there, that they're doing that. And it may look stupid from the outside and like it's just stupid symbolic gesture that does nothing in the end, because they basically go there, they kill a bunch of Seer Domin and everything, but in the end it's a worthless, meaningless gesture basically from the outside. But it's not, is what I'm trying to argue here. It's not a meaningless gesture if you are, and that's kind of ties in with that whole vows discussion that Canadas has with Itkovian earlier, when Itkovian is like, when Heaton is trying to get with Itkovian, and Itkovian's like, no, I have vows, and then Canadas explains that those vows are chains. Keep those chains in mind. Chains popping up everywhere in this book. Just saying. Like you made those to make sure that you would follow Fener and your faith. But once you are secure in your faith, you don't need those vows anymore. And I'll probably have more to say on that matter as well. I say that a lot today, don't I? Anyway. But the point is, if you are a believer, a true believer of Fener, you've made and that's what the people within the Grey Swords, what the soldiers within the Grey Swords are. You follow those holy rules, those few holy rules, the Rev of Fener. You follow that. And it doesn't matter whether someone else betrays you by calling on you in that situation, and they know that. But the point is, if they would, at this point, deny Wrath Fener and not follow after he has invoked the Rev, they would, at that point, now I have to use the word sin here now, they would sin as well. Like Wrath Fener, by calling them to betray them, is doing something unforgivable and terrible, and punishment will come. Or so they believe. But if they would not follow the Rev, they would also do something unforgivable within their world and their belief system. And since we all know that in this point religion is in play, their souls are in play. So dying while following the Rev of Fener means that once they die, they will probably get some kind of reward. We'll see about that kind of thing, because the afterlife constructions in the Menazim Book of the Fallen are kind of weird, but they will probably be somehow rewarded or at least acknowledged by Fener. But if they fuck up by not following the Rev, then they sin, then they are lost in their faith, then they are lost to Fener. And that is much more problematic. So Of course they go. They go in the knowledge of this that they are betrayed, but they go and do it anyway, and they do the best they can. And with that veteran then doing his like sword dance kind of thing, we see that with that knowledge comes a kind of freedom. You are there, you know basically that you're gonna die in this situation right now, and there comes a kind of freedom with that, and we see that expressed explicitly in that thing, in that dance scene when he gets killed after that. Once again, there's a lot of really powerful images within this first part of the third book. That dance scene is definitely one of those really powerful images, and I'll have like two more and then I'll end it for today. All right. The next one I need to talk about, and I'll probably jump back to stuff that I missed this time around as later on. Anyway, next one is the banquet. I don't want to call it Beggar's Banquet because that would be a Rolling Stones reference. I'm not sure I should make in this case, but you know what I mean. The scene after Itkovian takes the surviving or the final rest of the Grey Swords into Prince Jalakan's palace, and they find Anastar and his mother and like the chosen Tenaskari there having this mockery of a feast, actually eating the prince that they have roasted on a spit and stuff like that. And there's like several things going on there that I found interesting. The first of those is that the whole idea of the whole way it's set up, that set piece of that scene in that hall with Prince Jalakan roasting there and the Tenaskari lounging around and stuff like that. There's two things that reminded me of. One is the idea of that of the Saturnalia of the Lord of Misrule, that like for a certain that the entire like structure of society is turned upside down. And it kind of harkens to that, but it's like a really grisly version of that here. And the other one is that in its brutality, in its grisliness, I don't want to say gnarly because that's kind of Sarge Iskarjarek's trademark word here, but it's brutal. Anyway, in its explicitness, in its phantasmagorical violence and abhorrence in that scene, it reminded me a lot of like medieval depictions of evil and stuff like that. When you look at medieval paintings, I mean, I don't want to say Hieronymus Bosch because that's like late Middle Ages, I think, if I don't get my shit wrong right now. But sort of early Renaissance, late medieval times is Bosch, if I don't get it completely wrong. Yeah, he's still old masters. He's like, I don't know, 13th, 14th century, something like that. Anyway, you'll probably tell me that I'm wrong because you know more about art history than I do. Anyway, a lot of the stuff that happens in the in Kapustan with the Tenaskari reminds me of Hieronymus Bosch imagery, but even of other like religious tracts. And when you, if you have ever like looked at, I don't know, early prints, there's a lot of these leaflets from like the early printing age of the 15th century, when you have the religious wars around the Reformation. You have a lot of extremely violent imagery there. And when you go even further back into like the medieval times, you get a lot of religious imagery of, I don't know, the Feast of Satan, stuff like that. And the whole setup with the way this is like set up with Anastar sitting on the throne and Jalakan's body on that fire on the table, and it just reminded me a lot of that kind of imagery in a way, and that I found that very interesting. And I don't want to say cool, but yeah, in a way, just like how it was set up and described, I found very, very impressive. So that was that about that. Gods, what a sentence! That was that about that. No, let's go back. The next scene, and we should keep that in mind. The idea that Itkovian there says, "I will take your despair to Anastar," and Anastar is terribly afraid of that. And there's two levels in there. Like on the one hand, like Itkovian already says, like, yeah, he cannot because in him there is only despair. Despair is like the only thing he has. And without despair, he is hollow. And there's like, I guess there's a literal meaning to that. We might talk about that later on. And then there's obviously a very, how to say, um, like a more deep, like a deeper meaning in there, that a lot of people who have, for certain people, I guess, despair can become a very, very, like the driving force of their personality. When we look at, I don't know what, for example, the crippled god, we need to talk more about the crippled god later on, but the idea of people making their pain and their despair and at the universe, making that the driving force of all they do, making that their entire personality, is something that happens. It's something that has terrible, terrible consequences. Because from that follows a lot of pain and the drive to actually deliver pain to other people, as well, because it's like how that kind of thing works. And just keep that in mind. Also, the fact that Itkovian actually agrees to take on himself the despair and pain of Anaster, and I think we will talk about the idea of a shield anvil at another point even more. All right, final, extremely powerful image that I want to talk about. And this is more like one of those metaphor things. I'm not even saying that this is what Steven Erikson wants to actually show us in that scene. I'm talking about Tok the Younger and the Kachain Chimala matron. The insane Kachain Chimala matron. And her crushing Tok the Younger's body, then healing him, and because she just like hugs him, so embraces him so powerful, she crushes his bones, and then his bones heal improperly, so his body gets deformed. And the idea that love, like uncontrolled problematic love, can actually deform someone, is made very, very, very explicit in this scene. I feel like graphically explicit is what I'm trying to say here. And I found that just like very, very interesting. It kind of feeds back in a way to the Silver Fox Maybe thing that I spoke about yesterday, where the Maybe, obviously because of her old age, is also suffering bodily harm from that very, very problematic, toxic, I don't want to, yeah, well, it is a toxic relationship, but you know what I mean. I just felt that when I read that today, with the idea, when I read that thing about Tok's bones knitting improperly and his body being deformed by the love of the matron, of the Kachain Jamala matron, that just, as an image is extremely powerful. And with those sad thoughts, I'll leave you for today, and I'll talk to you tomorrow about more Malazan stuff, and then we'll see what I'll talk about on Saturday and Sunday. Until then, cheers.